Hello, good morning. It seems that we are starting. Okay. Okay, good morning. My name is Ignacio Lopez Verdeguer. I'm Director of Research and Innovation at La Caixa Foundation, and I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of La Caixa Foundation to this Caixa Research online training session. Today we are going to talk about output management plans, and well, it is going to be Ignacio Labastida, our trainer, that is going to share with you some insights. But before I give the floor to him, let me just share for a minute why we are doing this training today. First of all, thank you very much for being here today. That means that you share with us the responsibility of trying to have the maximum impact of our projects and try to facilitate that the results of the projects reach society. And what we try to do from La Caixa Foundation is that we are committed to open science principles. So we have, for example, a science museum where we try to engage larger society with the result of our projects. We commit to open access of our publications, but we try to do as well, we try to commit to, let's say, an intelligent portfolio management system oriented to impact. And in this framework is that why we ask scientists and research managers to do the open management plans. But we commit to help you to do so because we believe it is our shared responsibility. It is not only about you doing, trying to fulfill what we state as mandatory in your projects, but we believe that we have to give you as well the tools, the most interesting tools that are accessible to do the open management plans. And the most interesting thing that we can think of is to, for example, have the possibility to have this training with Ignacio Labastida. Ignacio has been collaborating with us for long. He's the director of the University of Barcelona Learning and Research Resources Center, the CRAI. I hope that I said it correctly, Ignacio. And he's been for a long time. He's an expert in open science and in this kind of resources. So I wouldn't like to spend more time with this brief introduction. Only I would like to thank you again for participating in this session, and to Ignacio as well to commit with us again to share his expertise with us. Thank you very much, Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for this kind introduction. Just a comment, I'm not the director of the CRAI, I'm just the director of the research area, so the research unit that provides support to our researchers in our institution at the University of Barcelona. So just that. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. We'll be together for the next 2 hours, and I will share a presentation with you that afterwards you can ask to have the slides if they are not provided to you by default. You can interact with me at any moment through the chat, or you can also raise your hand. I think you have the link to raise your hand in the participants list. And I see that there are some familiar names or familiar faces today. So probably some of you already have heard something that I'm going to tell you, but I must say that this training session is addressed to the center. So we did, I recall well, in October, a similar session addressed to researchers. So in this case, the session is different because the goal of the session is to prepare the research centers to help researchers in developing, in this case, the output management plan required by the foundation, but in general, to prepare the centers to support researchers in providing other management plans, for instance, the ones required by the European funders or currently by the Spanish funders. So I'm gonna start the session by sharing the presentation, and I will start with the outline of the session. The idea is to start with a context. Ignacio already mentioned the open science, so I will comment a bit why we are doing that, why we are concerned about the outputs and how to share the outputs. So I will put that in context. I'll begin with some considerations to start all this management, all this planning on how to deal with these outputs. We'll discuss about collecting and processing data, publishing and preserving. I will also like to discuss with you the cost of management, because sometimes when we talk about the management of data, we forgot to think about the cost, and there are many costs. I will show you and share with you a list of possible costs. Not all of you may apply all the same costs, but there are things that you can take into account, and especially because many funders allow this kind of cost as an eligible cost. So if you make a list of costs, you may be able to ask for some funding. I will also show you some institutional policies as an idea for you as an institution to have a kind of policy on how you can deal. We put the example of the data, but also you could deal with software or any other output that you could generate in your research institution. And a final recommendations, a general final recommendations. Afterwards, we will have a look of the specific case of the output management plan from La Caixa. What are the things that are the researchers are required to fill, because sometimes you may not be aware exactly what is the requirements of this plan. I know that some of you already have contacted me because the researchers have received some reviews and you are reviewing with them these plans, but maybe that some of you are not still are not aware of what is exactly the template that La Caixa is asking to the researchers. So I will keep asking for questions, so feel free to use the chat, as I said before, and raise hands at any moment, and we will stop at any moment to make clarifications or to solve any questions that could arise. So let's start with the context. And the context, as I said, is the open science. This is the image used by the Foster project. It was a project funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020. And in this taxonomy, you can see that the open science is an idea that applies to any moment of the research of the science. I always say that I hope one day we will not need to talk about open science. We'll talk by default about science that is open, about research that is open, and we will have to discuss when science or when research needs to be closed. I will talk later on about some closed data or some closed outputs that we need to close. But in general, I hope one day there will be not this need to put open in front of science, and we will discuss and we will have training on closed science. Nevertheless, here you see that there is access to publication, reproducibility, definitions, evaluations, etc. And there is an important part here talking about data, and specifically to open data. When I talk about managing research data, I prefer to talk about research data in general, not just open, because I think that to have at the end open data, that probably is what most of us want as a final goal. First, we need to manage well the data, and not just the data that finally will be published and will be open, but all the data that the researchers are dealing with, are managing, are collecting, are processing, etc. But as you see here, we have definitions, we have journals, we have reviews, and we will have an overview of some of these topics this morning. Why we are talking about open science, and Ignacio already mentioned in the introduction some of these ideas. But the idea is that we want that the science will transform to a better science, meaning a science or a research that is more open, global, collaborative, creative. But the idea, I think the main goal is to get closer to the society. I always say that it's not just that we need to go out to the society, it's also that we have to bring in the society and to share more with the society how we do research, which are our goals, how are our procedures, etc. But together with this definition that was stated a few years ago by the Commission, also we have to introduce other values in research, the values of efficiency, quality, integrity, reproducibility, equity, transparency, and public engagement. And that's why we are here today, to get to this final goal, to get this research or science more open. And in any of these last documents or policies or statements, especially in Europe, we have seen many of them. In any of these position papers, we always see that data is fundamental in open science. Of course, publications have a lot of relevance, and we still rely a lot on publications when we do research assessments. But to go forward into this idea of open science, we always discuss on having a better approach on how we manage data. And in this document that was published 5 years ago, when the Dutch were the presidents of the Council in Europe, this document was a call for action. I mean, we talk a lot about open science. There are a lot of theories about how to reach open science, but we need more action. And in this call for action in Amsterdam, there were two goals. The first goal was the scientific publications and how to get full open access to that scientific publications. And the goal was 2020. But the second goal was this new approach towards an optimal reuse of research data. We want data, not just data that is available in a public space, in a public repository, in a public website. We also want data with good metadata, with good formats. So to get that, we need a new way of managing data, or a better way of managing data. And because data sharing and this data stewardship is the default, we need definitions, we need standards, we need infrastructures, etc. And that's the idea of today's session, to discuss with you, to talk with you about how we as a research centers, we can apply these ideas and what we need for our centers to allow researchers to get this new way, or this optimal way of managing data, and at the end to reuse the data broadly. And when we talk about data, also we have this broad definition of what is data, because if you are in an experimental center, for you data could be data that comes from a lab or from an experiment. But if you are in social science, then data is different. A few weeks ago, I was in the law school, and I was discussing there with the professors about which data are they using, because the first idea for them was we are not using data. So taking here the definition of this organization called CAIXARESEARCH, that was an organization aimed at defining some standards on research information. The idea of data is this primary source that supports technical or scientific inquiry, research, scholarship, or artistic activity. And this data is the evidence in any research process, and is commonly accepted by the research community as necessary to validate any research finding or result. It could be digital or could be non-digital. It depends, again, on the disciplines. Also, we can classify data in experimental data, observational data, operational data, third-party data, public sector data. So depending of the typologies, depending of the source, we can make different classifications. And of course, in formats also, you can make different format classification. So at the end, many things can be seen as data in general. Moreover, when some of the policies at the European level are asked why you always demanding for data management plan and not a more broader management plan, they say, well, for us, software and other outputs could be seen also as data. And the idea is to have data not just for the sake of the data, but following a set of principles. And these are the principles that we are hearing in the last years, that we want data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This is the well-known acronym of FAIR. We hear quite often that our data needs to be fair. So that's the idea, that data needs to be alone, not just embedded in a paper, needs to be accessible by the people, but also by the machines, need to be interoperable, probably the hardest or the most difficult to achieve, and finally reusable. And we'll discuss later on that reusable doesn't mean that needs to be open. We need to clarify that fair data doesn't mean open data. Closed data could be also fair. Here you see these four principles and some ideas about the compliance, how we can comply with these four principles. Those principles were proposed for data, but could be applied for any outcome. We can think about also applying fair principles to publications, to apply fair principles to software, or to any other outcome that comes from a research activity. So we need that the resources is uploaded in public repositories. We talk about different solutions that we put together with the outcomes, the required metadata. Metadata together with identifiers that need to be unique and persistent, and then we can connect data with publications, with software, and with any other output. We need that the resources should be accessible for download and also for manipulation, as I said, not just for humans, ideally also for machines. We need to also try to get some contingency plans to assure that at least metadata remain accessible, even if the resource at the end had some problem of accessibility. Interoperability is this final goal to get that not just the metadata, it's all standardized and could be also connected with other repositories, with other facilities, but also that the data could be seen as following standard vocabularies or standard variables that could be reused, not just by your discipline, by other disciplines. And finally, the idea of reusability is that all metadata, all the data that is released includes information about how this data could be reused. An easy way of showing this reusability is by using a license, saying this data could be reused for free by default, etc. But if data needs to be closed, and sometimes it needs to be closed, then you can also specify how this data, even if it is closed or it has a restricted access, could be accessed in some conditions. And finally, once we have this fair data, what Europe is building nowadays is this idea of this open science cloud. The idea of not building another infrastructure, but connecting the existing infrastructures or the future infrastructures that we build together in our countries or internationally. The idea is to have like a layer, a kind of some people say like a Google of data, where you, as a researcher or as an institution, you could make queries and look for any data, any output, and asking, I want data or I want outputs with these or the other conditions, and to find them in any place of these infrastructures that are connected. So I will not need to go to several places to look for the data I'm looking for, because I will have a single interface where I could find this. And also I could have different profiles, and with my different profiles, I will access to some or other data or outcomes. So that's the final goal, to have this European Open Science Cloud. So this is the context, and this is the context that we are working on. As I said before, when we are trying to get a better outcome, better outputs to be reused and to build on future research, we need to start thinking from the beginning. Sometimes, and especially I come from the library, we were focused a lot on the publications. We were really thinking at the end of this research cycle. But when we think about sharing and data and sharing any output, we have to begin on thinking on this issue from the beginning. And here I share with you this infography where it's you can see the research cycle, when there are the different steps: the initiate, the conduction of the research, the preservation, the sharing, and to build on the existing research. And on the external part of this cycle, you see all the different steps in relation to data. So before conducting research, we need to think about how we're going to organize our data, and we can begin to do this data management plan, that in the case of La Caixa is what we call the output management plan. When we conduct research, we have to think about how we generate the data, where we store the data, how we process data, how we analyze and interpret data. Once the research ends, we have to think where we're going to preserve all this data. And also it's critical to decide which data we want to preserve, which data we need to delete, because we cannot preserve all data, and we have to make decisions about data that will not be useful in the future. Then we have to think about sharing data, and to think about the best formats and the best mediums where the data could be shared. Sometimes we don't think about that and from the beginning, and we may need to make conversions and to change formats to other formats. Maybe if we think about this before conducting research, maybe we could make better options at the beginning. And finally, when we share research in public repositories, when we publish data, we also may think about identifiers like DOIs, as we use in other outputs, about licensing, because sometimes data also has rights, and we'll discuss later on about these things. And finally, when we have this data available, then we can build on this data, as we do in some disciplines that we already use existing data that it's useful for our research, and we build upon this data for new research. Okay, so that's the context we are today, in the international context, the national context, and the context when we do our research. And let's start thinking about how we can help our researchers into having this final goal of sharing data and outputs in general. So the first relevant issues that we need to consider now, wearing as the role of the research center, is that we need to be aware of several issues. For instance, all the applicable laws and regulations that will apply to my research. There are laws, national laws, there are even some European directives that may apply to our activity. And also we have some regulations that could be external, but also could be internal. Our own institution may have some policies, on copyright, policies on research data, policies on privacy, etc. So these things need to be taken into account when we begin to think about how we're going to plan our data management. We also have to think about any restrictions that we have in our projects, agreements, or collaborations, because sometimes we sign agreements, we receive funds for a project, and there are restrictions. So there are things that we have also to take into account. Of course, any ethical issue that is related with our research has to be taken into consideration. We have to think about some research needs to have ethical validations, so we need to have that on mind. And of course, any copyright policy of the center, because at the end, if we want to share our outputs, we need to know how we're going to share it, who is going to decide how to share it, etc. And sometimes these copyright policies are not well known in the centers, and sometimes even they don't exist. Also, we need to foresee other issues. For instance, we need to raise awareness among researchers. This idea of output management plans, this idea of sharing outputs beyond the publications is somehow still new for many researchers. Yesterday, there was the last day of presenting projects to a Spanish call for research projects. And in this Spanish call, there was a mention about sharing data. And there were many researchers asking about what does it mean? What I need to do? What I'm required to do? So there is still this misinformation, this lack of information about how researchers need to do to manage properly the research data. So it's something that from the centers we still need to do to raise this awareness. Of course, we have also to look at ourselves and analyze our level of readiness in relation to data management, how ready we are to provide support, advice, facilities on research data management. We also could formalize all the different practices that we see in our center, but afterwards that we want to see in our centers. And of course, if we have a policy and a strategy, we need to define some indicators. So what we want to achieve. Sometimes indicators are not easy to do, but at the end, if we say, for instance, we want to have more data available for the society in general, and we can use indicators like to know how many data sets are available in this repository or the other repository, or for instance, if our goal is to have our researchers more ready to do that, and we are programming some training sessions, so as an indicator we can use the number of researchers that are attending these training sessions, or the number of training sessions that we are programming in a year or in a period of time. So as a suggestions for first step, I will suggest that from the center, what we can begin to do is to identify all the stakeholders. So all the people, all the units, all the services in our center that are involved in the data management. Could be, if it's a university, could be people from the library, could be people from the research management, could be people from the IT units. If it's a smaller research center, probably you'll need these IT facilities, you need the research, the manager of the research center, etc. Also, you can identify research data management champions. So identify researchers that are already performing a good data management, and they could help us in raise this awareness. We can use them for training researchers. We can use them to discuss with them which are the best solutions for them to manage data. Also, we can identify the data our center is already working with, because our researchers are already generating and collecting and using data. But maybe we, as managers of the research centers, we don't have enough information about which kind of data. So first, we can have this survey to think about which kind of data you are working with. And also, we can identify which are the current practices, because sometimes there are practices that are well enough. I mean, there is nothing to do. And we can also copy those practices in some groups and to explain those practices to other groups that might do things that could be better done. We can also ask some of these champions about data management plans that they have already created because of any funder has been required them. And of course, we can also identify our weakness for our ideal management. We can draft what would be the best management in our center, and then to see maybe we have no a good solution for this. We need better personnel. We need to train our staff, etc. And identifying this weakness will be helpful for the future. And then when we have all these identifications, we can establish a protocol. And the idea of the protocol was an idea that was proposed by Science Europe 3 years ago. The idea was it's not easy to have a data management plan or an output management plan for a center. The better is to have a general protocol, and especially protocols could be different for disciplines, because as I said before, each discipline could identify data in a different way. So the idea of a protocol is to have like a kind of framework that could help later on to elaborate the individual data management plan. If we have this general framework in a center, for a researcher, it will be easier to elaborate this data or output management plan, because in that specific management plan, they will include the details of each project or each research activity, but they will have a general idea of how we do things in our center. We could then define our protocol for a research center, a protocol that could be as general as needed, as broad as needed, and then in each task, in each project, then we could get into details. And then in this protocol, we could include all the laws, regulations, the facilities, which services are available, all the different standards of the different disciplines that we have in our center, how we achieve the FAIR principles, which is the support provided, and then with all this information, researchers will be enabled to create their own data management plan. So as a proposal, I would like to share with you this idea of having these elements, this list of elements. It's not a closed list, it's completely open, but the idea is to have in this protocol which are the laws and regulations that apply in our center. And these things sometimes are unknown for many researchers. So if we could have a list of them, it will help them when they take into consideration what they need to do for their research. We can also define who is responsible for managing data, who is responsible for accessing, which are the units and services that could support researchers in the data management, identify, clarify which are the different responsibilities of each service, which are the different facilities that you provide to work with data, not just for publishing, but also while researchers are performing their research. When they store data, when they process data, which are the facilities? Could be internal, could be external. Also at the end, which are the facilities to publish? Again, could be our own facilities, but also external facilities. And preserving data, the same. Which are the different standards and formats that are accepted by the different communities? Any specification on personal, confidential, and sensible data? Inform them about which are the different steps they have to follow when they work with personal, confidential, or sensible data, and any ethical issues to consider. Having this protocol, this list of how we do things in our center, will be easier for researchers to develop their own plans. And when we go to a data management plan, and here I will have a look in a general way, afterwards we'll have a look on what La Caixa is asking for. Here, in general, these data management plans are plans that are required by institutions or funders. Sometimes an institution could have a data management plan for a specific project, or for instance, some institutions are now requiring data management plans for PhD students. So in a data management plans, what the researcher needs to do is to answer some questions like which data will be obtained or will be reused, which formats will be used, which will be the standards that will be followed, how data will be processed, storage, and preserved, when data will be accessible and who could access that data, how data will be reused, who is the responsible for managing and accessing the data, and how ethical issues have been considered. So having the protocol previously, it would be easier for a researcher to follow or to draft their own data management plan and to present any data management plan to a funder or to their own institution. Because many of these questions are already solved in a general way with a specific protocol. There are different funders, and each funder has a different template. Nevertheless, most of the templates are quite similar. So most of the templates include the questions I just shared with you previously. Nowadays, we have official templates from Horizon 2020. Probably will be the same template for Horizon Europe. The European Research Council also has a very similar template, but they have its own template. And La Caixa has this template that it's not called data management plan, it's called output management plan. And there are many tools to create and share those data management plans by using those templates. We have at the Catalan level this EINA DMP, the DMP tool, that is an adaptation of a tool developed by the Digital Curation Center in Scotland, where they provide what it's called the DMP online, and there have been many adaptations to the different languages. Also, OpenAir, an international organization, offers another tool called Argos, and another initiative is the Data Steward Wizard. In our case, for the La Caixa Foundation projects, there is already a platform where the researchers can go there and fill the data management, the output management plan, and we'll see it afterwards. This is a template as an example. This is the template from the Horizon 2020, and as you see here are the different sections. The first one is about the summary of the data, explaining the formats, explaining the different data that will be collected, will be reused, will be created, etc. A second section about fair data, how we could achieve these fair principles. Any allocation of resource that is needed to develop this management of the data. Any issue related with data security, any ethical aspect, and any other issue that could be taken into consideration. You'll see later that this template is very similar to the template that is used by La Caixa. So one of the things that we need to think about it is how we're going to manage copyright and intellectual property rights in our data and in our outputs. Many data is not protected by copyright or intellectual property rights. However, when we compile data, when we include data in a database, then we can generate, could be protected. Some rights are generated. So we have data that can be protected, like images, text, or other creation that it could be considered original. But the creation of a database, even it is not original, even it only includes figures, it only includes text that it's not copyrightable. The creation of the database, as I said, grants the creator some rights in relation to the extraction and the reuse of the data. So it's important from the point of view of the center to define who owns this copyright, who is the copyright holder. Some institutions have some policies on databases saying that the rights on the database belongs to the institution. Some institutions also use the same policy for databases and for patents. So they say that the owner is the institution, but if there is a possible commercialization, there is a sharing of the revenues. And also there are some laws, for instance, in Spain, we have some laws that state that any creation that arises from the research activity belongs to the center or the institution where that research activity has been performed. So by using those regulations, by using those policies, by using those laws, then we need to specify who will be the copyright holder in the case that the data or any other output is susceptible to have these rights. When we think about ethical aspects, also we need to raise awareness among our researchers that they have to consider two issues. First of all, that in many cases we need ethical approvals of our research, and usually the approval is granted by an ethical committee. So that's another issue that we have to take into account. And when we develop these data management plans, we have to include these topics. Because some of these topics, the copyright and the intellectual property and the ethical aspect, sometimes are topics that are forgotten in the management of our data. And the ethical approval is not just for biomedical research, it's also for many social projects, social science, social research, when we interact with people. And here comes the second issue that also we have to take into account is all the personal data. We need to consider privacy rights, to minimize the collection of personal data, implement security measures, implement anonymization or pseudonymization techniques. And those are things that we need to provide some solutions to our researchers. And we need to also identify our data protection officer and ask for advice for any of these issues. And in some cases, if the research it is performed affects the privacy of the people, we need also to perform a privacy impact assessment related to the personal data used in our research. So these things are sometimes critical for a research, and we need from the centers to provide advice and to provide services and to provide clear guidelines to our researchers. And the important thing is that all these things on personal data are, first of all, it's very important, and you see in many cases that everybody is asking for fair data, but I want to share with you this infographic to show you that fair data is the last point when we are dealing with personal data. Before thinking about how we're gonna reach this idea of the FAIR principles, when we do research for using personal data, first we have to think about the design of our research, to think about the privacy, how privacy is affected by our research. As I said before, sometimes you need this privacy impact assessment or data protection impact assessment. We need to think about how we're going to inform the participants of our research, and how we're going to control and put our data in a safe place that it will be no unwanted accesses on the data could not be accessed by non-desired people. And at the end, we will think about how we're going to make this data fair. There are different possibilities, as I said before. There are anonymization, pseudonymization, closed data that could be also informed by open metadata, etc. So let's think now about the collection and the process of data. We have already seen how we begin, how we start planning. So which are the main issues that we want to take into consideration when we plan the research. And now let's start performing the research. So first, we need to think about when we collect data, how data could be reused if data already exists. And that's also an important issue in many cases, for instance, in social science, when some research is performed by using existing data. We need to explain our researchers that data that is public doesn't mean that it's reusable without any limit. I put here a couple of examples. One data set that it's publicly available, but it's not openly available, so meaning that there are restrictions on the use of that data, and another one that it's public and open available. So we have to think about if we are allowed to use the data, and afterwards if we can also publish that available data together with our data to see how we have built upon the existing data. So the first example is a typical example where data is available in a website or in a portal, but there are some terms of use. Some terms of use that have to be taken into consideration. And this data is here available for scientific analysis, but it is limited to a specific time period. And you need to delete all the data you got from this site once your research has finished. So in this case, the data is available, but it is not allowed to reuse it beyond your research. And you cannot, of course, publish this data together with your data. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration. However, the other one, it is a public data set in a public repository and under a license or under a legal tool called CC0, that is a kind of public domain dedication. So meaning that this data that is available here could be reused without any limit. So these are differences on accessing some public data that needs to be taken into account when we are reusing data. Another important thing is to take into account the formats. And of course, as a center, it's very difficult to say these will be the formats used in our center, because it depends on the several disciplines, the several research fields that you have in your center. So it's more like talking with your researchers about which are the current practices, not just for them, but for the community they work with. And that's the first advice I said at the beginning. So in many cases, it's not easy to have a list of formats because every discipline has their own standards. And of course, also the formats are sometimes depending of devices, of software that is used. However, you as a center can establish a list of recommended or preferred formats that will enable the reuse and the preservation. And that's another important thing, that if we want to preserve the data for a long term, we need to use some formats that could be preserved. And sometimes when we put the data in some specific places, those specific places will explain us which are the formats they prefer. So as a suggestion for the center, I will suggest to identify which formats are generally used by the researchers, check with them how standard they are, and then set this list of recommended formats. And if we have new people coming to our center, we can tell them these are the formats that we support, these are the formats that we preserve. So this is our recommendation. If you choose other formats, then probably those data could not be optimally reused and could not be optimally preserved. Of course, we can use existing lists and we can adapt to our needs. And this is an example. This is a list provided by DANS. DANS is the Dutch National Archive Service, and they have a list of preferred formats and non-preferred formats. And they say, well, if you are using our preferred formats, we commit to our policy of preservation. If you don't use our formats, we cannot commit to them. Also, we can share with our researchers best practices on organizing data, especially if we work in research groups, because it's easier to use meaningful names, to use a good organization of our folders, to work in teams. If we are using our own words, if we are not using meaningful names, it will be hard for others to know what is inside our folders or to know what is inside our files. So it's also a good practice to share with our researchers some good practices on organizing folders and to use meaningful names. And also another good practice is to explain researchers that they need to document the data. Sometimes the documentation of data is already provided by the tool they use to manage the data. For instance, in this case, the SPSS provides a file with documenting the data. If you put here the name of the variables, which kind of variables there is, the labels, the different ranges, etc. That's very important to train the researchers with how they need to document data, because at the end, when we publish data, we will need this documentation. And another important issue that we need to consider is which are the storage facilities we provide to our researchers. We need to determine which will be the best solutions for each case. Of course, we sometimes will need security places. We need safer places than others, especially when, for instance, we're dealing with personal data, with sensitive data. But also we have to think about the size of the data, the topology of data. So there are many solutions, and there are solutions that could be combined, and there are solutions that could be temporary. For instance, I can go with my laptop to a specific lab, gather, collect my data, and then go to my office and then upload the data to a cloud or to whatever. So we need to provide information about which are the existing facilities in our centers. Of course, there are computers, laptops, disks, external cloud services, shared institutional services, specific. I would like to share with you this idea that the University of Utrecht is providing to their researchers. This is a kind of wizard with the different solutions they have. On the right, you have the different boxes with the different basic storage, box scriptor, surf drive, Teams, etc. And then there is a list of 8 questions on the left-hand side when the researchers can decide, well, if they need data to share with their colleagues outside the institution, if they need big data, if they need some kind of confidentiality. And once they begin to click to the different answers, they got the different solutions on the right. Each time they click one different answer of these 8 questions, some of these solutions on the right disappear because they don't fulfill the requirements of the researchers. You have the link here and you can have a look, and you might have a similar tool or similar wizard to help your researchers on deciding which is the best solutions among the ones that you can provide them. Could be solutions that are our own solutions, but also solutions that we have externalized. And finally, working with all in this idea of the working with data, we have to think also about the new roles. Researchers need staff to support on the management of data, and we have different roles, and we heard about these roles in many cases: the data curator, the data scientist, the data librarian, the data engineering, etc. Probably what is the most known is this idea of the data steward. And we could say that the data steward has a role of connecting researchers with the tools, the policies, the information. So this data steward could be the person in our center, could be a lab, could be the center, it could be a faculty. It depends on the size, and of course it depends also of the resources. And you could have this person that is connecting researchers, explaining them which are these tools, which are the policies, which is the information they need to manage the data. This data steward could be the one who can provide advice and can provide training to the researchers. And of course, they could also play an important role in the designing of the services. This is a couple of images on showing which could be the roles of a data steward. So in this case, from the University of Delft, Technical University of Delft, they have data stewards for each faculty. They are former researchers. They have a PhD studies from the different disciplines. And what the data steward does there is he does training, advice. He analyzes or she analyzes the cost, provides information about the tools, provides information on how to comply with the different funders, how to archive the data, provides information about the new things developing in this area of research data management, and helps researchers on developing data or output management plans. Another way of seeing that, this is also from the Netherlands, is that the data steward is a bit the link between the policy, the research, and the infrastructure. So the data steward plays a role on aligning researchers' data and handling with data policy, aligning researchers' needs and required data infrastructure, and align the data policies and the features of the data services and infrastructures. This is a role that could be played in any of your centers. And of course, at the end, all the data management needs different elements that all are together aligned, and that all these gears work at the same time. So we need the data stewards together with the researchers, together with the ICT, together with human resources, together with the central board of our centers. And it depends, of course, of your center. This picture could be adapted to your situation, because here, for instance, this is the Technical University of Delft, and here they have the graduate school, or they have the faculty management, things that are not in your research centers, but it could be applied in a similar way. This idea of that it's a work, the management of data and the management of any output, it's a work that has to be performed together for different parts. Let me have a look, because okay, is someone asking for the session in October? Probably we will provide you with the link afterwards. So if there is no questions on this specific section, we'll go at the following section. So we have, let's say, perform our research. We have been helped by our data stewards, or by our data curators, or by our data scientists. We have the data, and now we have to think about how we're going to publish or preserve the data. And of course, publishing data also needs to have a reflection on where I want to publish the data. And as a center, we have to think which will be the different choices that we can provide our researchers. First, probably the first choice is to have a subject-based repository. there is not a real need to have our own repository if our researchers already have a consolidated repository. So it could be a good option if a repository already exists. I'm just thinking, for instance, in research on biodiversity, they got this GBIF, the Global Biodiversity repository, or research in genetics could use GenBank or similar repositories in different disciplines. But there are still many disciplines where they don't have a repository, and then we have to think about facilitating our own repository. And it could be our institutional repository, but also we can partner with another institution. There are some research centers that partner with universities, and they together use the same repository. And also we can have a repository together with a consortium. This is the case, for instance, now in Catalonia, where universities and research centers are using the same repository for research data, and we use this consortium repository. And of course, the third option is always to go outside and to use different external options, because there are several external options that we can use. If we think about the first option, as I said, for me, it could be the first option if it exists. I mean, if there is a consolidated subject-based repository, this probably is the best and the first option that we need to provide our researchers. And there is a directory of research data repositories in the link, in the URL that it's on the screen. So for a research center, probably it will be important to identify those subject-based repositories and to have a list of these are the repositories, these are the different conditions, the different features that they provide, and inform our researchers about them. The second one, as I said, is to build our own repository. Probably if we want to do that, we have to think about a good solution that is suitable for managing data. For instance, in our case, at the Catalan universities, most of us are using as a repository, as institutional repository, a solution called the Space that is mainly suitable for documents. And for many of us, we thought that it was not the best solution for data because it was not really thought for data. So that's why, together with the Catalan consortium of university service, we were thinking of having another solution. And that's the reason we built together this new repository for data. And when we decided which would be the best solution, we thought also on which would be a good solution that could implement these FAIR principles. And then I share with you this report that it was created when taking this decision on FAIR for FAIR. And here there is the title in Catalan, but the report, I think it is in English too. So this is something to take into account if you want to build your own repository. And finally, as I said, there are these options, this external multidisciplinary repository that sometimes you could see that they are free for use, but when the free options are sometimes limited to the size of your account or the size of the data files you can upload. However, you can always ask for different pricing options, and they can provide you with some solutions. By paying, you could have larger amount of data or a larger amount of accounts for your researchers. And also some of these external solutions provide institutional solutions. It's the case, for instance, of Mendeley data or the case of Fixture. So any of these solutions, the subject-based, your own repository, alone or together with other institutions, or these multidisciplinary repositories, taking any of them or a mix of them, because sometimes at the end you have a mix of them. As a recommendation for a center, I may suggest that you could create an institutional data catalog or institutional output catalog if we go beyond data, to collect information, to know where your data is in the world, meaning that we know, for instance, where our researchers publish. We ask them, where have you been published? I mean, give me your DOI, give me your reference, and we have this information, but we don't know where the data is published in the different repositories all over the world. We may know which is the data that is in our repository, but all the data that is created in our center, but it's deposited in all these different places, we are not aware of. So I suggest for a center to begin to collect this information, and then also we could have a more clear picture on which are the different solutions that our researchers are using. Here, there is an explanation of the different features of these multidisciplinary options, these external options, and with the different limits. I'm not aware if the repository of the Autonomous University is already working. It wasn't last week or a couple of weeks ago. So because the link that where this table is provided is broken because of this hacker attack they received in the middle of October. Hopefully soon the link will be operational again. And of course, when we publish data, we have to think about how we inform people about how they can reuse the data. And that's the other thing that we have to take into account, because not saying anything, it means just that the data is with all right reserved, meaning that they cannot be reused only with an authorization or only, but what the law permits. So for instance, for individual users or for quoting, etc. And when we decide to open data, when we decide to publish the data, we need to think about who is the copyright holder in our center, who could be the one to decide that this data could be open and how could be open. And this decision is important because you have different choices on opening data. There you have the typical Creative Commons license with all the different elements, non-commercial, non-derivative, share alike, that could be applied to a database with the last version, the version 4.0, all these features of non-commercial or share alike or non-derivative applies to a database. You could also use this CC0 tool that I mentioned before in an example of the dataset. And also you can also have this set of license from the Open Data Commons. But of course, also we need to learn on how we close the data, because in many cases, data cannot be open. And the access to the data needs to be restricted. We can open the metadata, and it's important to open the metadata because we can inform people about the existence of the data. And we can provide information about the access and the use terms. And then we could follow the FAIR principles. We can design a standard data user agreements and to provide these data user agreements to our researchers, and researchers could have an idea on how they can restrict the access to the data. And of course, we can establish anonymization, aggregation, or the other techniques like differential privacy techniques to provide a certain level of access to the data. And an example of sharing closed data is this example from the Harvard University, where they tag the data on different colors. They open all the metadata, but all the data that is below the green, so yellow, orange, or red or crimson, requires a specific registration or a specific validation to access of the data, because the data is sensible, is restricted, and cannot be accessed. However, people know that the data exists, and then they may contact the holder of the rights and get granted access to the data. This is an example also of this data use agreement that could be used also to provide access once it is signed and agreed with the parties. And finally, also there are different methodologies of preserving data. That's also an important thing that as a research center we need to think about it. The data, once the project is end or the research ends, we need to determine when which data will be preserved, which data will be deleted, and as I said before, the data could be published or the data could be closed. There are different policies that state that a good period of time to preserve the data is at least for 10 years, to commit that for 10 years the data will be available. There are discussions about from when we start counting the 10 years, people saying not just from the creation, maybe if the data is being reused commonly, then we have to think about the last reuse of the data. But also you have legal obligations depending on the data you have, and you might be required to keep data for more than 20 years. And on the other hand, we have data like the personal data that needs to be deleted as soon as possible. So this data in many cases needs to be deleted and not to be kept. So we need to also provide some scenarios for our researchers to understand how they can keep the data, how they can delete data, etc. And finally, think about the cost. And for the cost from an institution, we have to think about all the different processes that we have in our management. We have to think about cost of collection, cost of documentation, cost of storage, cost of access and security, cost of preservation, cost of availability, and in any general cost that we can include in our management. For collection, we can have costs related to organizing and formatting data, if we need people that is dedicated to this task. Other costs related, for instance, to transcriptions, cost for authorization on reusing data, cost on the description, the documentation of the data, cost related to the use of the space, to the backup copies, the cost related to external accesses. If we need to grant access to people from outside, we may have more costs. Cost for preservation, maybe we need to convert the data into a standard or open formats, and of course, cost for long-term storage, and cost to possible clearance of copyright. We might have to clear some rights that we didn't clear at the beginning, cost of digitizing, cost of publishing in a repository, and in general, we can also think about the cost of the staff involved in all the management and any training that we want to do and perform with our researchers. So to reach at the end of this first part, we can at the end, taking into account all these different steps in the management of the data, we can think about a general policy, a general institutional policy, something that I suggest here based in a project called LEARN, where they have different sections. A possible model could include a preamble justifying why we have this policy, which is the jurisdiction that is applicable, to whom affects this policy, any property rights that is involved, to whom belong these property rights, could be usually copyright, but could be other rights, how we will handle the research data, which would be the way to handle research data, all the responsibilities, rights, and duties, the validity of this policy, and finally, any annex with definitions. But I think the most important of the policy is to think why we want this policy, which is our goal or our goals, what we want to reach, and finally to have these indicators. This is together with the policy, the model that the LEARN project provided, they also provide this idea of the CAIX performance indicators to have achievements. And the performance indicators that don't need to be the same for everyone. And we don't need to have the expected values from everyone, because each of us will start from different points. So we might say we want to increase this value in 10%, we want to increase this in 100, in 220, etc. So that's also very important, that if you decide to have a policy, to have some indicators to follow how you are performing and how you are achieving the goals. So the final recommendations for these good management practices, and before entering to the details of the output management plan, I suggest to, first of all, identify the current situation. Define all your roles, services, and facilities that you want to provide to your researchers. Evaluate all the different costs involved in the management of your outputs. Establish a policy or a strategy on data management on your center. Establish a protocol for your researchers to help them to develop those different data management plans, and raise as much awareness as possible among researchers and provide them with many training sessions in all these different aspects. And I will end here and open the floor for any question, any comment before having a detailed look on the output management plan that is required to fill for the CAIXA Foundation projects. So please, if you want to raise your questions in the chat or raise your hand through the participant list, at the bottom, I think you have a click where you can raise your hand. I don't see any question or any raised hand. So if there are no questions, I will go ahead and have a look at what is required in this output management plan. And as you will see, it's similar to other templates, and it's oh, I see something now in the chat. Yes, the slides will be shared. I think it was mentioned before. So all the shares will be shared, no problem at all. Okay, so this is the platform that the researchers can access to, and there are the different issues related with the project. And one of these parts or sections of the platform is dedicated to the output management plan. There are the application details, we have the code, etc. And here we have the different parts of this output management plan where the researchers can fill the information, and afterwards it's reviewed, and if it's all correct, is validated, and if not, researchers are asked for clarifications or for improving the information that they provide. So which is the information they need to provide? So first of all, there is this output summary, similar to other templates. And what is needed here is to describe which is the data or output that they will generate or collect, which are the formats and standards that they will be using, the value of the output that may have for other researchers, and what data or output cannot be shared and why. As you see, all these different items are related to all the things that we were talking about before. Of course, if you as a center already provide, for instance, with formats and standards, a list of these recommended formats and standards, for them it would be easier to put things here. Other things are in detail. I mean, you cannot have a general description on why your data or your outputs will be valuable for others, because this is something related to specifically to this to this project. However, you could have also some information about why some data needs to be kept restricted, needs to be kept close, and also could help in the last item of this list. A second section is about responsibilities. And here, of course, if there is a clear definition of responsibilities in your center, it would be easier for researchers to answer these questions. They need to indicate who will be monitoring the plan, and this probably is the principal investigator, the one who is monitoring the plan, who is managing the data or the outputs, and who is in charge of preservation and conservation. This is the crucial point, is specific to specify who will decide about the access, and in the case of intellectual property, who will own the rights. This question sometimes is kept in blank because they have no a clear idea of who will own the rights. So this you from the centers probably could help researchers on answering this question if you have already some clear policy about who owns any intellectual property rights. After, on the third section, the researchers are asked about fair data. And first of all, about the F, so the findable data, and they need to indicate which metadata will be used, which identifier will be used for data, and which version control will be undertaken if there is a need of version control. In these cases where we have dynamic data that we are changing the data set in a different period of times because we are aggregating new data or we are changing some of the data in the previous data set. Again, if we have already decided some solutions when we provide researchers with the different options of publishing data, for instance, these different options have handles, have TOIs, have any indicators, any identifiers that could help researchers on specifying here which are those identifiers that they are going to use in the future. When we talk about accessibility, they need to specify the ability of the data, who can access to the data, which methods or softwares are necessary to access the data if this is a specific data, if the documentation of the software is included, and if it's possible to include it, where the data, metadata, documentation, and code are deposited, and how access is granted to those cases where restrictions are necessary. Again, having information about the different options they have on depositing data and having different options about how they can grant access when data is restricted could help researchers on fulfilling this section. Once they filled the accessibility, they are asked about interoperability, and here is a question that applies very specifically to the different disciplines, because some disciplines, they already have these control vocabularies. They use these vocabularies to to define some geolocalization or to define some variables, and they can mention these vocabularies once they are asked about interoperability issues. And the final is the reusability, and here is the needed information about how they're going to grant reuse of the data if the data is open. But if not, if the data is not open or needs to be embargoed, then they can specify here for how long there would be restriction on accessing the data, or how researchers or people interested in the data could contact the copyright or the owner of the data, or the one who can grant access to the data to access to the data that is published. The next section is about security, and of course here there are many questions where researchers are sometimes not well informed about the secure storage facilities and which are the different safeguard security options that your own facilities provide to them. So probably provide your researchers with some information about the different situations of your storage facilities, how the backups are performed, etc., will help them on this issue. And the same with the ethical review. Probably most of them are quite aware, if they've been performing research for a long time, about the different processes they have to follow for ethical validation. But I'm still seeing research, especially in the field of social science, that they are not aware of these ethical approvals or these ethical aspects when they perform interviews or when they perform recordings, in general, when they act or interact with people. So probably we will need to raise more awareness about this issue among our researchers. And that's all. I mean, I see here some thing in the chat, but please feel free to ask, and I will have a look now at what is in the chat. There is information about the other session. I don't know if Nuria, you want to pose your question opening your mic?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this nice training. So my question was related a little bit on how to follow from all these steps that you have, all the recommendations that you have given us today, in case that we still have doubts or questions, like is there any particular document or any, I don't know, like a national contact point or somebody that could help us in solving some questions that we may have in the way to implement really like a team of people at our center that can help researchers to follow the data management plans.
Just a question, an initial question, Nuria, for you, Nuria Barros.
Yeah.
From which center are you coming from?
We are from Portugal, from the International Library and Nanotechnology Center Laboratory.
Okay, I'm aware that in Portugal there are some network on data management. I know that, for instance, I don't know if there is a real contact point in Portugal, national contact point, but I'm aware that, for instance, the people from the University of Minho, they are performing some training sessions together with different institutions, and together with the Fundação Ciência e Tecnologia, FCT. So you might contact them and see which is the situation in Portugal.
Okay.
Regarding, I mean, sorry, yes.
No, maybe this is a different question that I can ask later.
No, I just wanted to mention that regarding training for researchers, there is also these some resources in the Foster webpage, this project I mentioned before about fostering open science practices, and also for training there is a handbook for performing training with researchers, the Foster handbook training open science or something like that. I forgot about the actual name, but you can check on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And then the other question was more related to the output management plan. If because we will submit it now, but will there be placed? I mean, in the future, can we still update it?
Yes,
because there are some things that we are still not clear about, so we will need to revise it, I believe.
Yes, I'm one of the reviewers of these plans, so I could explain you how it works. You submit now information about what you plan to do, and we will review it, and we will give you some feedback some feedback that could be some recommendations, telling you, well, this I will recommend to do that, but also could be some crucial items like, oh, there is no information about this or the other thing, so please, you need to review it. And at the end, you also have to provide some information about how you've been fulfilling that plan, and you can give some information about the changes you have included in your plan. I always say that the data management plan, or in this case, this output management plan, is something that needs to be dynamic, because research is dynamic. I mean, we plan to do things at the beginning of our research, but at the end, things change, and we may include some change. So it's understandable that the data management plan could change all over the period of your research. So it's normal, and it's typical to have those changes. So at the end of the project, you can include those changes or say, we have fulfilled this and this, and we have made these changes because the data we were supposed to create, we couldn't create because of this or the other reason, or we have performed another experiment or another activity that led us to other kind of data.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. By the way, Nuria, you have from Elizabeth Ramos that you can talk also with someone from Porto about this topic.
Okay, thank you very much.
More questions? More clarifications from the output management plan or in general with the management of data? Well, I must say that the researchers were more curious and they asked more questions. Maybe they were more affected with this output management plan. But anyway, if you have further questions, you could contact me. I think in the presentation there is the contact details. So if there are no questions, we can leave it here. And thank you very much for your participation. And I hope you could use some of these recommendations and to help your researchers on getting this better research data. It's not that the goal is not to have the best output management plans. The goal is at the end to have better and optimal data to be reused and to build research upon research that has already been performed and not to repeat again and again the same. So thank you very much and see you in another time.